Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Martin. I'm joining you here today from Gatorade. We're excited to be here today to talk about the GX Sweat Patch. The GX system includes the Sweat Patch and GX teams, which you'll learn about today, which are both based on years of research from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute team. While some of the science you're going to see today is complex, the science has been validated time and time again, and both the GX Sweat Patch and GX teams will make what historically is a complex process of manually sweat testing athletes much simpler and easier to do for an entire team all at once. The Gatorade Performance Partner community, as many of you know, is built on the fundamentals that we believe have the greatest impact on sports performance professionals at every level through development, performance, and collaboration. As you know, by joining the community at GatoradePerformancePartner.com, you can unlock access to exclusive benefits like complimentary CEUs, science-backed resources, as well as the opportunity to discover all the latest that Gatorade has to offer. So we're proud to be here today and appreciate you joining us because we're going to talk about the GX Sweat Patch and the Teams app, both of which are built upon Gatorade Performance Partners' performance pillars. Through this community, we will give you access to new products and innovation to sports performance professionals first. We know that having the support from you is really key for athletes to trust and use our products. So we look forward to bringing you along the ride as we launch this GX Teams app and welcome your feedback on this new offering. We know there's improvements to be made in the app and the GX system. So our goal is to continue to improve, innovate, and achieve success with your help. So through the Gatorade Performance Partner, you're going to receive this exclusive access, and together we can fuel greatness. I now want to welcome my colleagues from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, who are going to talk through the GX Sweat Patch, as well as GX Teams app. So please first welcome Anthony Wolf, who is a senior scientist at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute Satellite Laboratory at Baylor Scott and White Sports Performance Center in Frisco, Texas. His primary responsibilities are athlete performance testing, recovery, and research at GSSI in Frisco. He's also been very instrumental in the science surrounding GX Patch, and we'll be sharing this with you during today's session. Anthony is also joined today by Kevin Lors, who's an associate principal scientist and registered dietitian based out of GSSI's Bradenton lab, housed within the IMG Academy. And his primary responsibilities include leading GSSI athlete service team. So please join me in welcoming Anthony Wolf. And before we do so, just remember, we will go through this, and at the very end, we'll open it for questions, and we'll answer some of your questions and go to the Q&A. So thank you, and please welcome Anthony.
Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate the warm intro there. Like she mentioned, I'm based in Frisco, Texas, and over the past year to year and a half, my role has really been about taking the science behind the GX Sweat Patch and translating it for practical application and practical use. So this journey really, of developing and validating the GX Sweat Patch started back in 2017, so about 4 years ago now. And thankfully, the patch it was launched earlier this year in March and is available at Dick's Sporting Goods and Gatorade.com. And it measures, or rather I should say, it predicts the athlete's sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration during exercise. And it does this by analyzing color changes within the patch, which is then translated by the GX Teams app on an iPhone. But before we get into the specifics of the GX patch and the science behind it, I wanted to give a brief overview of why we thought this wearable would be useful to athletes in the first place. So when we're looking at the hydration recommendations published by various sports organizations and associations like NATA and ACSM, they really emphasize that because of the variability between athletes, it's important to personalize fluid replacement programs to prevent significant overhydration and dehydration. In other words, if you know an athlete's sweat rate and their sweat electrolyte concentration, it helps in developing a hydration plan with the goal, of course, to prevent significant dehydration, which is typically defined as a body mass deficit of more than 2%, with, of course, overdrinking as a negative outcome as well. It's also suggested that athletes should consume fluid or sodium along with that fluid if sweat sodium losses are quite large as well, which can happen in scenarios if you have some combination of long or particularly intense exercise with high sweat rates or someone who has salty sweat. And we'll go through some data that will provide some context to what I mean when saying high sweat rate and sweat electrolyte concentration. So if we talk a little bit more about this concept of individual variability in sweat losses, we at GSSI have conducted a retrospective analysis of the athletes tested by GSSI over the past 15 to 20 years or so. And as you can see here, or as you see here, the sweating rate of just over 1,300 athletes tested in a variety of sports and multitude of conditions, air temp and humidity, durations, that sort of thing. And what we can see is that the sweating rate ranges anywhere from about half a liter, which is pretty minimal, all the way up to 3 liters or more on the high end, which is quite rare, but does happen in those more extreme environments with high exercise intensities or particularly large individuals like football linemen. But why is this? Why is there so much variability in sweat rate? And there are actually several factors that are involved, as I'm sure you can imagine. And two of the most important factors are exercise intensity and body size. Basically, the faster an athlete runs and the more weight they are carrying, either through their body mass or maybe wearing heavy equipment, means there's more metabolic heat production and their muscles are working harder. So over the course of practice, of course, the environmental conditions are another important factor in determining how much sweat needs to be produced and then evaporate to adequately cool the body. So essentially, it's all about how much your body needs to sweat to keep your body temperature at the appropriate level. And one thing that comes up from time to time is this question of, well, we know athletes sweat, but do we actually really need to measure it? Can't athletes just estimate their sweat losses based on perception, how sweaty their clothes are, or maybe how much sweat's coming off my head and dripping off my nose? And actually, there's been several studies that have looked into that. And on this slide here, we're looking at athletes' self-perceived or estimated sweat rate as a percentage of their actual measured sweat rates. And the blue bars here represent group averages of these studies. So as you can see here, most athletes don't do a great job of estimating their sweat rates. Most of the time, actually, they significantly underestimate their sweat losses, but in some rare cases, they can even overestimate how much sweat. I mean, we can look at the college basketball conditioning there, which is almost off the charts. So essentially, the take-home message here is that these significant under and overestimations of how much athletes think they sweat can lead to inadequate or inappropriate volumes of fluid intake to compensate. So this is why it's important to obtain objective measures of sweat rate to help inform those hydration strategies. So I switch gears a little bit. To this point, we've only been talking about how much athletes sweat. So we'll jump into what that sweat composition is or what's in the sweat. Because we know that sweat is more than just water, of course, with the other primary components of sweat, mainly being sodium and chloride. And in this analysis of that sweat data set I mentioned previously, we also looked at sweat sodium loss and saw considerable variability there too. athletes lost anywhere from about 0.2 grams per hour, so very, very little, all the way up to over 2 grams per hour, which of course is on the very high end of the scale. But again, it does happen in those extreme circumstances. But you can think of a large football player competing in, summer training camps or OTAs, something like that. So then the question becomes, well, how do I know where my athlete or even my team of athletes falls on this super broad scale? And that's where sweat testing comes in. But the standard way of conducting a sweat test is actually very labor and time intensive. It involves a lot of different individual helpers, several different measurements and pieces of equipment to actually measure everything. For example, body mass, both before and after exercise takes place. And then we'd also need to weigh any food or fluid that's consumed by that athlete during the exercise. And then we also have to use that absorbent pad you see in the middle there to collect sweat from the forearm. And then we need a centrifuge or a plunger to squeeze the sweat out of it. And then finally, we'd have to analyze that sweat sample for the sodium concentration that we're looking for. So obviously, that's a long list of steps, requires specialized equipment, and all of that precludes any ability to give any kind of quick results or feedback to an athlete there on the spot. So the idea was to use recent technology advancements to make sweat testing easier and more accessible to everybody. Essentially, try to remove all of those steps mentioned on the previous slide and just use one patch, one phone. And we recently published our results validating that testing conducted with over 300 athletes in this journal here called Science Advances. And we actually have another paper we're working on right now where we tested an additional 150 athletes. So we jump back a little bit. In 2017, Gatorade and GSSI partnered with engineers from Northwestern University and a startup company, Epicor Biosystems, to develop this single-use patch that measures forearm sweat rate and sweat chloride concentrations during exercise. And this slide shows a sort of high-level description of how the patch works. So the sweat comes into the patch through two small inlets on the underside of that GX logo, where the patch actually adheres to the skin. One of the inlets has a well where the sweat comes in and mixes with a non-toxic orange dye that actually progresses through the patch, as we can see, and that's how the forearm sweat rate is measured. Then the other inlet, the sweat mixes with a purple dye that changes the sweat color based on the chloride concentration within that sweat. The higher the chloride concentration of the sweat, the darker the color purple is in that channel. You can see that there on both the bottom right of the patch, as well as the shade changes in the bottom right of the slide. You may have noticed that I kind of switched there in the middle and went from talking about sweat sodium to sweat chloride. So they're a little bit different there, but the reason why we measure sweat chloride is for this particular wearable, there's not a great method for sodium measurement on the body, but there is a very, very well-established method for chloride measurement. And what we do is essentially use chloride as an indirect measure for sodium, because we know that virtually all sodium in sweat is lost in the form of sodium chloride. So if we look at the graph on the slide here, you can see there's a really strong correlation between the two. So we can pretty easily convert sweat chloride to sweat sodium concentration. Here we get into a little more of the details of the GX sweat patch and some more images that help illustrate what the patch and what the testing look like. If you look at the top row of images, panels A through C, you can see the layers of the patch, the inlets, and the bioassays I was describing earlier, whereas panels F through K show images of the testing we performed. We compared the GX sweat rate and sweat chloride concentration to those obtained with our standard sweat testing methods that I described earlier, that full bomb process. First, if we look at maybe D, F, and G, the panels on the slide there, we can see we tested the patch in the lab, make sure it worked in controlled conditions. And then we took the patch to the field during live real world training sessions. And you can kind of see those examples down there on the bottom of the slide. Now, I mentioned the patch measures forearm sweat. So the goal is to use this forearm sweat to help predict whole body sweat losses, which of course is more useful than if you only have information on the sweat from a tiny part of the forearm that doesn't necessarily tell you the whole body situation. But we can use that information from the forearm to predict how much sweat is lost from your entire body surface area. So we collaborated with the PepsiCo data science and analytics team to develop prediction models to determine whole body sweat losses. Based on this analysis, we found that in addition to forearm sweat rate, these 6 other factors listed on the slide are important to include as inputs or predictors in that model. So this info is entered either manually by the athlete or the practitioner, or it could even be collected via connected devices or smartphone apps, which can then be used within the algorithm to generate that whole body sweat rate. This slide here shows the scatter plots for predicted versus whole body sweat chloride on the left and whole body sweat rate on the right. So here we're looking at the measured versus the predicted. And essentially the take home message here is that the GX sweat patch produces sweat profiles with 82% accuracy when compared with the conventional research grade sweat testing methods. And finally, it's worth noting the current scope of the GX sweat patch's validity. So what are the conditions it was tested? Basically, the patch and the algorithm in the accompanying app are applicable in the ranges and conditions in which it's been tested. So you can see those ranges for body mass, exercise duration, air temperature, and even the exercise types and activities that we've tested so far. And this is kind of the part where I'll turn over to Kevin, and I'll let him get into more of the details about how and why these inputs have specific practical considerations.
All right. Again, happy to be here. My name is Kevin Lures. I'm one of the scientists for the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, and I've been lucky enough to be a part of not only the GX Patch initiative, but the design of the GX Teams app, which you'll go into a little bit more detail tomorrow. And so I want to go into a little bit more detail on the practical application of the GX Patch and specifically how to apply the patch to your athletes. A little bit about what I do is I am the lead of our US service team. And what we do is we essentially go out across the nation and test athletes of different sports and in different conditions at different levels. And so I've actually been a part of GSSI for 2 years, a little bit past 2 years. But before this, I was working in the sports world in the NFL. And I've learned a ton about sweat testing, specifically that standardized method that Anthony was talking about. And so I think there is this not misunderstanding, but just this wonder of what all goes into sweat testing. And essentially sweat testing, it measures how much you sweat and how salty your sweat is. That's what we tell athletes. And there's a lot that goes into it. Like Anthony was saying, it's very labor intensive, time intensive. And for some sports like football, you need a lot of staffing. And so the great thing about this patch is that whereas standardized conventional patches just take a sample of sweat to measure sweat sodium concentration. This patch does both. It will take that sweat sodium concentration measurement as well as measure sweat rate, or I should say predict sweat rate. And so it's essentially a two-in-one type of tool. And the importance of bringing the science to the forefront is to just give you a very basic overview of everything that has gone into making this patch and validating this patch against the gold standard and the standardized sweat testing. So in doing so, we want to bring the sports science to you in an easier way. You know that a lot of the practitioners are wearing multiple hats in their organizations or their athletic departments. So in order to bring the sports science, specifically with such a fundamental aspect such as hydration, it's important that we make it easier for you. And not to be too redundant, but just wanted to reiterate those points that Anthony was making on the inputs. Not only are we taking a sample of sweat and being able to measure how far it goes through that channel, that orange channel, and take that quick scan via the app, via your iPhone. That's one of the inputs. The other inputs are biological sex, body mass, air temperature, sport, exercise duration, and energy expenditure. And a little bit, I just want to hone in on those four that were outlined in that box for a little bit, because it's very, very, very important to understand that as we validated, I wouldn't say in a narrow span of conditions, but we were basically, we were given what we were given. So we had different types of athletes and different types of conditions. So anywhere from 95 and 330 pounds, as well as between 20 minutes and up to 2 hours of duration, as well as between 46 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit, were the athletes and the conditions that we tested in. So what I'm trying to say is that as you're using the patch, you definitely have to keep those in mind, because if you use it outside of these ranges, the results will not be as accurate. You're going to have you're going to, and you might even get an error message within the app saying, "Hey, you are outside of the validated ranges." Now, with that being said, it's very important to emphasize that this is just a starting point. This is the first version, and that as we continue to validate more and more athletes in different conditions, that range will expand. So just like I talked about body mass, air temperature, duration, we're limited to the sports right now to running, both indoor and outdoor, indoor cycling, fitness or high intensity interval training, something that we label as conditioning, both indoor and outdoor. And we define that as intense circuit style workouts, including brief aerobic components. So more or less, like I said, like it says in here, HIIT training. Sports such as basketball, soccer, lacrosse, tennis, track and field, and football are other sports that we validated. And specifically with football, it was with just helmets, no pads during the individual or position specific periods of practice. Again, can't emphasize this enough that this is a starting point, and we will continue to expand this list of sports and activities. Now, the point of my talk is to really give you the best overview of best practices for applying the patch. So just to kind of verbalize this before I actually get into the demo here, is it's really, really important to remember that the patch can only go on the left ventral or the left inner forearm, okay? And make sure that that you place it about 2 to 3 inches below the elbow crease. So that's the first thing. You also need to remember to clean that area before you apply the patch and let it dry for about 30 seconds. I think some practitioners have thought that they are able to towel dry the forearm off, but just let it air dry, because you can actually recontaminate what you tried to clean off with the alcohol pad. You just want to make sure that the skin is free of lotions and sunscreens. And if an athlete tends to have a hairier inner forearm, just make sure to shave, just make sure that they shave that area. Now, when applying, it's important to make sure that the GX logo is facing the athlete, and to press down for 10 seconds. And it doesn't just stop there. You have to remember, as they're training, you need to keep an eye on it and make sure that the athlete isn't physically poking or picking at the patch, and making sure that the patch isn't damaged in any way, because that will definitely mess with the results. And also, it's important to keep an eye on that orange dye throughout their training, and make sure that it doesn't reach the end of the channel. And I'll show you that here in a little bit. But just keep an eye on that, because if it reaches the end of the channel, the results can be inaccurate. And so, again, application is one thing, monitoring is another. And so I am going to talk you through that and demo it here in a little bit. On this side, on the left side, is an example of what the patch looks like on the athlete's forearm. Again, I said making sure that GX logo is facing the athlete when applying. But essentially, athletes can test themselves using their own GX app. And obviously, you can test the athletes using the GX Teams app. All right. So this is what the patch looks like, and what it looks like when they're scanning their own patches. But when you are scanning your athletes' patches using the GX Teams app, using your iPhone, this is what it's going to look like. So just a very brief illustration of what that looks like. All right. So now I'm going to have Anthony take the slide off of the screen, and I'm going to switch my background here so you can see my beautiful house. And so remember, I'm going to shift over here. It's important to place the patch on the inner left forearm, as you see here. Again, making sure that it's about 2 to 3 inches away from the elbow crease right here. So I guess an easy way to remember this is to just place the patch on the meatier part of the forearm, okay? And remember, before placing the patch, really important to clean the area with an alcohol swab. Again, I have a pretty hairy forearm, so if you need to, then go ahead and have the athlete shave their forearms and let dry for 30 seconds, all right? And as you are letting that dry, you take the patch, again, pretty simple, take the layer of film off the back, and like I said before, make sure that the patch, the GX logo, is facing the athlete, all right? So as we demonstrate here, I've got 2 to 3 inches away from the elbow crease, inner left forearm, okay? Place the patch and then press down for 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it's placed, all right? Again, it's not just over with a patch application. Remember to monitor the patch throughout training. Again, the end of the channel that I was mentioning before is right under the GX logo right here. You'll see this kind of form a little snake swim channel with the orange dye. And it'll start from the top and go all the way down. And here is the end of the channel. That you just have to make sure that you monitor and make sure that it doesn't reach the end of the channel. So that is a little demo of patch application and monitoring. So with that, I will kick it back to Michelle for some Q&A.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Kevin. It was great. And hopefully you all feel a little bit more informed about the importance of, the application and why we have the patch as you head into this. So we're excited. Looks like we have one question. And I think this could be directed at Kevin. I know it's something that maybe if we can go deeper on, if we can, but are there plans to make sweat patches validated for more sports than what you had listed on your slide?
Yeah. So there are plans for that. As a matter of fact, our team had just done some validation with outdoor cycling. So like I said before, we had validations for indoor cycling, but even further than that, more team sports. I think we're actually looking into the possibility of hockey. That's a pretty unique team sport that there's a lot of challenges with that, but that would be a big one. And so, yeah, just to, that laundry list of activities and sports that will continue to grow as we do further research and validation.
Great, thanks. We have another question. What do I do if my athletes' sweat patches aren't filling up?
Yeah, good question. So if they're not filling up, there could be a number of reasons. I'd say more often than not, there was some sort of error in what we found with doing some of the beta testing with how practitioners, athletic trainers, dietitians were applying the patch. And so I will reiterate what I was saying before, and making sure to follow the instructions and follow the FAQs that are within the GX Teams app. Before you do anything else, I would urge you to read through the FAQs and get a good feel for both the patch and the app, because that will be sort of it should be a pretty fail-safe way for you to make sure that you have a successful test.
Great. We have another one that's asking, do you have any recommendations for someone who isn't a heavy sweater or someone who is?
Well, kind of like what Anthony was talking about, I would say more oftentimes than not, we say that we're heavy sweaters. If we're a heavy sweater, we're a super heavy sweater. Or if we're we think that we're a moderate sweater, we're a heavy sweater. So I think with this patch, anytime that you can quantify anything for that matter, it just makes it a little bit easier for us to get a good visual of what that looks like and then what we need from that. So testing is the first thing, and then the second thing is which is what you'll get from the app. Not only the prediction and the data of what your sweat profile looks like, it's also the recommendations from those sweat profiles. And so that's the nice thing about the patch, is that it's a single-use patch, but you can use or you can test multiple times, because you will want to do that. Because with these differing conditions, let's say, for instance, with football, you start off in fall camp or training camp, it's very, very hot, but the seasons change obviously as the season goes on. So you can actually have a different sweat profile midway through the season. I think the misconception is that a sweat profile is like a fingerprint and that it doesn't change, which is completely untrue. And so that's the benefit about these patches, is that you can test and retest and gather up multiple profiles as you go. So, and with that, the app can make credible recommendations from those predictions and from those conditions that you're essentially plugging into the app that will take place during the training.
That was a great question. The final question I have is around, and I guess it could be for Anthony or Kevin to answer. Is parental consent necessary for minors who are creating an account and using the patch? Does Gatorade or Gatorade Sports Science Institute have access to people's accounts to use as data?
Anthony, you want to take that one, or I can take it?
Yeah, it's up to you, Kevin. Yeah, I can jump in if you want. Yeah, so our algorithm, I believe anybody under 13, it won't be necessarily valid for. So if we're going younger than 13, it probably isn't necessarily worth testing that individual at the current moment with the sweat patch anyway. As far as using data, there's no way for us to publish that data, share that data publicly, or know what an individual's sweat rate is from using the app. We can't pinpoint that individual.
Great. And then this might be our last question, but keep them coming. These are great questions. Do you recommend having the same athlete get tested twice as opposed to testing more individuals? I think maybe that, Kevin, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yeah, great question. So I think a lot of practitioners, a lot of athletic trainers, a lot of dietitians, even strength coach, sports performance professionals in general, some of them can have a pretty good feel for their heavy sweaters. Maybe they're salty sweaters just by, sometimes you can see that white residue on jerseys or equipment, for baseball players, it's ball caps, what have you. But I would say, like I said before, the great thing about this patch is the frequency at that which you can test. The other thing is that it's such an easy application of the patch that you could test multiple athletes at one time. So I guess the answer to that question is both. You can test multiple athletes. We would recommend that you test not as many athletes as you can, but if you have those salty sweaters, or those that you suspect being salty sweaters, heavy sweaters, or even your cramp prone athletes, definitely hone in on those. And then not only that, but you can test those athletes multiple times. Again, such a great point of this technology.
Great. There's another one. I'll leave it up to the both of you to decide who wants to answer this one. But what was the self-predictor model questionnaire that was used for the different individual sport athletes that guessed their own sweat rate, i.e. the men's basketball conditioning? Did GSSI maybe create that questionnaire? I'm not sure. Does that question make sense? Do you guys need further clarification, or does that?
No, yeah, that makes sense. No, that wasn't a GSSI study. I believe I cannot remember his first name, but that Dr. O'Neill actually published that one. So I'm not exactly sure the entirety of the questionnaire, but essentially it was just a study using the same methods that we would typically use in our research to measure an athlete's sweat rate, and then they would broach the athlete and say, how much do you think you sweat over the course of this hour-long practice, and then compare the two. So.
Great. Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have. I haven't seen any others come through the chat. All great questions. I'm really excited for, all of you that are participating in this. Like we said, we're really excited to, venture and be able to help provide additional tools and education to get that much closer to helping our athletes perform their best. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope you all are able to join tomorrow's session as well to go a little bit deeper in terms of getting onto the app and how to really get around and use it. And hopefully you found this session helpful today. So thank you again for joining. Thanks to Kevin and Anthony for the time, and good luck. Thanks again.
Thank you.